Before the world demands anything from you, you wake up, not to answers, not to clarity, but to a quiet question hanging in the air, one that decides more than the rest of the day combined, because in that first breath, before the phone lights up, before the weight of expectation settles on your chest, before anyone needs you to be anything at all, your mind is unclaimed territory. And whether you realize it or not, a line is being drawn. This moment is small, almost invisible, yet it is where focus is either claimed or surrendered, where direction is chosen or delayed, and most people never notice it slipping away. Marcus Aurelius knew this moment well, not as a statue carved in marble, not as a name echoed through history, but as a man opening his eyes to pressure, responsibility and disorder waiting patiently for him beyond the room, a man who understood that the battle was never out there. Never in the crowd, never in the noise, but here in the first thoughts of the morning. He did not wake to comfort, he woke to duty, and that is where his strength was forged. Mornings are not habits you fall into. They are tests you either meet or avoid. Every distraction that steals your attention before the sun fully rises trains your mind to scatter before the day has even begun. There is a quiet tension in this hour, a stillness that carries weight, because what you allow into your thoughts now will follow you into every decision you make later, shaping your focus, your patience, your resolve. This is not about productivity, not about rushing, not about forcing energy. It is about command, about learning to stand steady before the world leans in, about choosing discipline before comfort has a chance to speak. The Stoics understood that mornings reveal who you really are, stripped of applause, stripped of excuses, stripped of distraction, and if you listen closely, you can feel it too, the gravity of this moment, the sense that something important is at stake because it is here at the very start, that your focus is either mastered or quietly handed away. The Stoics believed that life does not wait for you to be ready, and Marcus Aurelius wrote this not from comfort but from experience, reminding himself each morning that he could not control what the day would bring, only how he would meet it, echoing Epictetus' grounded teaching that it is never events themselves that disturb us, but the judgments we attach to them, a truth meant to be remembered before the world has a chance to provoke a reaction. Morning for the Stoic was the only hour not yet claimed by demands, meetings, messages, or opinion, the brief window where the mind could be trained before it was tested, and Marcus spoke to himself plainly in his journal, noting that when the day begins, you should prepare to encounter difficult people, not to resent them, but to remember their actions cannot touch your character unless you allow it. This was not pessimism dressed as wisdom, it was protection, a way of stepping into the day already steady, already aware, already armed with perspective, because when difficulty is expected, it loses its power to shock and scatter your focus. Compare that to the modern morning, where attention is handed over instantly to alerts, headlines, and other people's urgency, leaving the mind reactive before it has even chosen a direction, a sharp contrast to the ancient practice of preparation, where silence and reflection came first and distraction came last. Marcus was not writing for an audience. He was correcting himself, grounding his thoughts before command, conflict, and consequence took over. And that discipline is the quiet difference between a day that controls you and a day you can stand inside with clarity. This is why mornings shape destiny, because the way you enter the day trains your focus to either hold its ground or collapse under pressure, and once that pattern is set, it repeats itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but faithfully every single day. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself at dawn with a firmness that leaves no room for comfort, reminding his own tired body that rising was not optional, that work was not punishment, and that being human meant contributing rather than hiding. And when he told himself, at dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being, he was not offering poetry. He was issuing an order shaped by years of command, war, and responsibility. This was a man who led armies along the Danube frontier, who reviewed troops before sunrise, and who, according to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, maintained the same personal discipline in camp as he expected from his soldiers, rising early, keeping routine, and refusing excess even when absolute power allowed it. Stoicism rejected the idea that comfort should decide your actions, because comfort dulls the will, and Marcus understood that every time you delay the morning, every time you negotiate with the bed, You are rehearsing surrender, teaching the mind that hesitation is acceptable before effort has even begun. Focus in this sense is not something you search for later in the day. It is something you obey early, because obedience to principle builds authority within yourself, and without that authority, attention fractures under the smallest pressure. Modern psychology echoes this ancient insight when researchers speak about decision fatigue, showing that each small choice drains mental energy, while Marcus removed the choice entirely, treating rising as duty rather than debate, a way to conserve focus for matters that truly required judgment. Your bed is not rest in that moment, it is temptation, and each snooze does more than steal minutes. It trains the brain to pause when it should act, to delay when it should move, and Marcus Aurelius knew, as both emperor and student of philosophy, that a mind trained to hesitate in the morning will hesitate again when discipline is demanded later in the day. Before the day applies pressure, the Stoics trained the mind to feel it in advance, a practice they call premeditatio malorum, not to invite trouble, but to remove its power, and Marcus Aurelius reminded himself in his private notes that he should begin each morning prepared to meet interference, delay, criticism, and misunderstanding, because none of these were new or personal, only part of human affairs. Seneca explained this plainly in his letters, advising his friend Lucilius to rehearse hardship ahead of time so that, when it arrived, it would feel familiar rather than overwhelming, writing in effect that the person who has already counted the cost suffers less when the bill comes due. Modern minds often break under stress not because challenges are unbearable, but because they arrive unannounced, crashing into expectations shaped by ease and constant reassurance. Whereas the Stoic morning assumed resistance as normal training focus to stay firm when conditions tightened. This rehearsal was not dramatic or fearful, it was calm and deliberate, like checking equipment before a storm, acknowledging that meetings may fail, people may disappoint, plans may shift, and time may be wasted. Yet none of this needed to disturb the inner command if it had already been accounted for. Epictetus taught his students to say to themselves before stepping outside that they would meet crowds, noise and frustration, reminding them that these were externals beyond control, while their responses remained their own. A lesson that builds psychological immunity by turning shock into recognition. When adversity is expected, it loses its edge, pressure becomes manageable, resistance becomes workable, and as the Stoics understood through lived experience rather than theory, what you expect cannot break you, because the mind that has already faced difficulty in the quiet of the morning does not panic when it appears in the open light of day. Before the day begins asking for your attention, the Stoics insisted that you claim it for yourself, and Marcus Aurelius treated stillness not as absence, but as discipline, choosing quiet moments to gather his thoughts before letters, petitions, and commands flooded in. A habit echoed by Seneca when he warned that a mind exposed too early to noise becomes scattered before it has a chance to stand firm. In the ancient world there were no phones or headlines, yet the principle was the same, because distraction has always existed in different forms, and Epictetus advised his students to guard the ruling faculty of the mind as something fragile, reminding them that once attention is pulled outward too quickly, it is difficult to bring it back under control. Today, the moment the day begins, many people surrender focus without resistance, scrolling through news, messages, and updates that carry urgency but rarely direction. And research in cognitive psychology now confirms what the Stoics observed through experience. That attention fragments rapidly when overstimulated, reducing the brain's capacity for sustained focus long before meaningful work begins. Silence in the morning is not withdrawal from reality, it is preparation for it, a way of allowing thoughts to settle before opinions arrive, and Marcus used this quiet to remind himself who he was meant to be before the world attempted to define him. Seneca wrote candidly about the harm of constant interruption, noting that a distracted life feels busy but produces little depth, a warning that feels even more relevant now, when stimulation is endless and unfiltered. By choosing silence first, you reclaim sovereignty over your thoughts, deciding what enters and what waits, and as the Stoics understood with clarity and through restraint rather than theory, the mind that wakes to noise never truly wakes at all. Marcus Aurelius never intended his writings to survive him, and that is precisely why they matter, because Meditations was not philosophy for display but correction in real time, a private discipline where he challenged his own reactions, questioned his motives, and reminded himself how a rational mind should behave under pressure. He wrote in short, direct statements, often repeating principles not for emphasis but because mastery requires return, and historians note that these entries were likely made early in the day or late at night, moments when the mind is most honest and least guarded. This act of writing was not reflection for comfort, it was command, a way to force clarity onto thoughts that would otherwise drift, because when a thought is written down, it must take shape, and once it has shape, it can be examined, challenged, or dismissed. Seneca described this same practice in his letters, explaining how he reviewed his day in writing to measure where he acted with reason and where he allowed impulse to lead, showing that journaling was not emotional release but moral accounting. Modern neuroscience now echoes this ancient habit, with studies showing that structured writing reduces emotional overload and sharpens focus by organizing competing thoughts. Yet the Stoics arrived at this conclusion through lived discipline rather than date. A chaotic mind keeps everything moving at once, hiding contradictions behind speed, while an ordered mind slows thoughts down enough to see them clearly, and Marcus used writing to separate what mattered from what merely felt urgent. Focus in this sense was never accidental, it was built line by line, thought by thought, and the Stoics understood that a written thought cannot hide, because once it is on the page it either stands up to reason or it does not, leaving you no choice but to govern your own mind before the day attempts to do it for you. The Stoics believed that focus is not strengthened by ease but by resistance, and Marcus Aurelius reminded himself repeatedly that the body should be trained to obey reason rather than comfort. A principle echoed by his teacher, Junius Rusticus, and reinforced by the wider Stoic school as a daily discipline rather than an extreme act. Seneca wrote plainly about this in his letters, describing how he practiced cold exposure, simple meals, and periods of intentional restraint, advising his readers to rehearse hardship while conditions were still favorable, so the mind would not panic when comfort was removed. Explaining that a person unfamiliar with discomfort becomes unsettled by the smallest inconvenience. This was never about punishment or self-denial for its own sake, it was about sharpening presence, because when the body experiences controlled discomfort, attention narrows, awareness heightens, and excuses lose their grip. A pattern modern behavioral science now supports by showing that mild physical stress can increase alertness and cognitive control. Musonius Rufus, one of the most respected Stoic teachers of the 1st century, argued that training the body alongside the mind was essential, stating that philosophy must be practiced in action, not discussed in comfort, and that those who avoid hardship remain unprepared for life's demands. Comfort, when left unchecked, softens attention, encourages delay, and weakens resolve, especially in the morning when the body is deciding who will lead for the rest of the day, impulse or intention. Morning discomfort, whether through cold restraint or disciplined effort, acts as a signal to the mind that this day will be met deliberately, not passively, and Marcus lived this truth as an emperor who endured campaigns, illness, and exhaustion without surrendering command over himself. This is why the Stoics understood something many forget, that if you cannot command your body in the morning, it will command you all day, shaping your focus around ease instead of purpose, and once that pattern is set, it quietly governs every decision that follows. Marcus Aurelius returned to this idea again and again in his private notes, warning himself not to be dragged in many directions, reminding his own mind to do what lay in front of him properly and with care, because excellence to a Stoic was never about volume, it was about precision. He wrote that if you focus on the task at hand, acting justly, calmly, and without distraction, you are already doing enough, a principle reinforced by Epictetus, who told his students that trying to carry multiple roles at once weakens judgment and scatters effort, leaving nothing finished with integrity. The Stoics rejected multitasking, not because they lacked ambition, but because they understood how attention works, that the mind loses strength every time it switches focus, a finding modern cognitive research now confirms by showing that task switching reduces accuracy and increases mental fatigue. In the morning, this principle became a moral obligation, because choosing one clear duty was a way of respecting time itself, treating it as something valuable rather than disposable. And Marcus reminded himself that life is made smaller when it is divided carelessly. He believed that rushing from one concern to another was not efficiency but avoidance, a way to feel busy without committing fully to anything that mattered. By selecting one direction early, the mind settles, energy aligns, and resistance weakens, because attention no longer leaks into unnecessary decisions. This was not rigidity, it was clarity, the discipline of deciding what deserved your best effort before distractions began making that choice for you. The Stoics understood that scattered effort rarely announces its cost. It simply erodes progress quietly, day after day, and that is why Marcus treated focus as a form of self-respect, knowing that when your attention is divided, so is your character. Scattered effort is silent failure, and the morning is where that failure is either prevented or allowed to take root. The Stoics drew a firm line between effort and outcome, and Marcus Aurelius reminded himself repeatedly that his responsibility ended with doing his work well, not with controlling how it would be received, writing that you should act with reason and let the rest unfold as it will. A discipline that kept his focus steady even when leading an empire under constant pressure. Epictetus taught this distinction directly to his students, telling them in plain terms that some things are up to us and some things are not, and that peace begins the moment we stop confusing the two, a lesson designed to remove anxiety before it can fracture attention. Anxiety, both ancient and modern thinkers agree, narrows perception and scatters focus, because when the mind is fixated on results it cannot see the task clearly, and Seneca warned that the person who is anxious about the future never gives full care to the present, losing effectiveness through worry rather than lack of ability. Stoic focus was never frantic or desperate. It was calm and deliberate, grounded in devotion to the process rather than obsession with reward. And Marcus wrote that you should not tie your sense of worth to outcomes beyond your control, because doing so hands your peace to chance. This contrast between obsession and devotion is where attention either sharpens or dissolves, since obsession chases validation and burns energy, while devotion commits fully to the work itself, allowing the mind to remain settled even when results are uncertain. The Stoics understood through experience rather than theory that clarity survives only where anxiety is removed. And that is why they return to this instruction so often: do the work placed before you with care and discipline, then release the rest without complaint. Because when effort is honest and steady, fate no longer needs to be negotiated. The Stoics never treated these practices as isolated techniques, and Marcus Aurelius was clear with himself that discipline only works when it becomes ritual, something repeated regardless of mood, energy, or circumstance, because a code followed daily reshapes character over time, rather than chasing short bursts of motivation. Waking without negotiation, rehearsing adversity, choosing silence, writing to correct the mind, accepting discomfort, committing to one clear duty, and releasing outcomes were not optional tools to be picked at random. They formed a structured order, a way of entering each day deliberately. And Marcus returned to these same instructions across years of writing, because repetition was the point, not a failure of imagination. Seneca reinforced this idea when he warned that progress in philosophy comes from steady practice, not inspiration, explaining that habits repeated daily sink deeper than lessons heard once, a view echoed by Musonius Rufus, who insisted that philosophy must be lived consistently or it becomes decoration rather than discipline. Modern behavioral research now confirms what the Stoics observed without instruments, that repeated morning routines shape neural pathways, making focus more automatic over time, while inconsistency keeps the mind reactive and easily pulled off course. This is why the Stoic morning was treated like a code, not advice, because advice can be ignored, but a code is followed, and Marcus understood that the smallest daily actions, repeated without drama, quietly determine who commands the mind in moments of pressure. Years of steady mornings do not announce their power. They compound silently, building attention that does not panic, discipline that does not argue, and clarity that does not depend on circumstances. And this is where the surge of Stoic strength comes from. Not force, not noise, but quiet authority earned over time. Master your mornings and no one owns your mind. Marcus Aurelius returned often to the fact of death, not as a threat but as a guide, reminding himself that life is short, uncertain, and already in motion, writing plainly that you could leave life right now, and that this truth should shape what you do, say, and think. A reflection born not from theory, but from years surrounded by illness, war, and loss. This awareness, known to the Stoics as memento mori, was not meant to darken the day, but to sharpen it, because when time is understood as limited, mornings stop feeling ordinary and begin to feel precise, deliberate, and worthy of care. Epictetus spoke to his students with the same urgency, telling them not to postpone the work of becoming disciplined, because delay assumes time that no one has been promised, and Seneca warned that most people waste life as if it were endless, only to realize too late how little of it was truly lived with intention. When you wake in the morning, Marcus believed you are being given something specific, not just another day, but another chance to act with reason, restraint, and clarity, and to waste that first hour is to treat existence itself as cheap. Modern thinkers may speak about legacy or meaning, but the Stoics spoke about presence, about meeting the day fully awake, because focus was their way of honoring life as it actually is, rather than how they wished it would be. This is why mornings matter so deeply when life is short, because they are the first proof that you are still here and still responsible for how you use the time in front of you. And when you approach them with discipline rather than drift, you turn attention into respect for existence itself. You woke up today, and that was not guaranteed, which is why the Stoics would tell you without drama or fear that the way you rise, focus, and act this morning says more about how you value your life than anything you say later in the day. You don't need more motivation, and Marcus Aurelius would be the first to tell you that inspiration fades while discipline remains, which is why he reminded himself that the quality of your thoughts determines the quality of your life. A statement grounded in daily practice rather than hope. Excuses feel convincing in the moment, but the Stoics treated them as signals of divided attention, and Epictetus spoke plainly when he told his students that if you want progress, you must stop explaining yourself and start practicing what reason already demands. Morning discipline is not loud. It does not announce itself, and it does not rely on emotion, because its power comes from repetition carried out quietly when no one is watching and nothing is being rewarded yet. Seneca observed that the greatest strength is developed away from the crowd in habits so consistent they no longer require effort, and this is where focus becomes stable rather than forced, shaped by routine instead of urgency. What you have built each morning in silence follows you into pressure, into conflict, into decision, giving you a calm center that does not react blindly or chase approval, because it has already been anchored before the day began. This is the Stoic resolve, not intensity, not hype, but steadiness earned through small acts honored daily. And when the next morning arrives, as long as it does, the instruction remains simple and firm. Rise without argument, meet the day with clarity, and carry yourself as someone who understands what is within their control and what is not. When you rise tomorrow, rise like Marcus Aurelius did, ready to work, focused on what matters and unbreakable in the quiet strength that no one else needs to see.